Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On October 12, 2013, at 20 o'clock sharp, the large mansion in Scottsdale was dead silent. The elderly Griffin couple sat by the phone, waiting for a checkup call. It was an unbreakable agreement. Their son Richard, a 32-year-old successful architect, and his 26-year-old wife, Agnes, were to report back every night while on vacation in the Grand Canyon. Richard was a pedant who was never even a minute late, but that night, the phone never rang. None of the family knew that the black Mercedes E-Class had already left the parking lot of the El Tovar Hotel and disappeared without a trace into the darkness of the Arizona desert with 2 passengers. This disappearance would be the beginning of one of the state's most terrifying mysteries, the solution to which would be more terrifying than death itself. On October 12, 2013, the Griffin family's luxurious Scottsdale mansion was in a tense silence. The hands of the antique clock in the living room were approaching 8 o'clock in the evening. For 68-year-old Robert Griffin and his wife Helen, this time was sacred. Their only son, 32-year-old Richard, and his 26-year-old wife, Agnes, were on a long-awaited vacation to the Grand Canyon. The trip had been planned for months, and one of the main conditions of the trip was a strict agreement. Every night, at exactly 20:00, the couple had to call home. This requirement was not a manifestation of parental control. Robert Griffin had recently undergone a complicated heart operation, and any excitement could have been fatal for him. Richard, a successful partner in a prestigious architectural firm, knew this better than anyone. His meticulousness and punctuality were legendary among his colleagues and friends. He was never late for a meeting, his drawings were always perfect, and his promises were always unbreakable. That's why when the clock struck 8 and the phone on the lacquered desk remained silent, anxiety hung in the air. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Robert began to pace the room nervously, clutching his chest from time to time. Alina tried to calm him down, assuming that the young people were just looking at the sunset or had problems with the connection in the mountains. She dialed her son's number. The rings went through, but no one answered. The phone of Agnes, a talented restorer, was also silent. At 9 o'clock in the evening, Robert could not find a place to go. Anger at his son for his negligence mixed with a sticky fear that tightened in a cold knot in his stomach. They waited until midnight, but the phone screen did not light up. The morning of October 13, 2013, began not with coffee, but with a call to the El Tovar Hotel. It is a historic hotel located on the very edge of the south rim of the Grand Canyon, a place where presidents and movie stars have stayed. Elena Griffin, barely able to contain the tremors in her voice, asked to be connected to the suite where the children were staying. After several long minutes of waiting, the receptionist said that no one was answering the phone in the room. At the mother's insistence, the hotel staff used the master key to enter the room. What the maid saw forced the administration to immediately call the police. The room looked as if its occupants had left for just a minute. Expensive suitcases stood open on their stands. Agnes's scarf was lying carelessly on the armchair, and dry toothbrushes were on the shelf in the bathroom. But the main detail indicated that the night had not been spent here. The wide double bed was perfectly made. The blanket was not crumpled, the pillows untouched. Richard and Agnes Griffin did not spend the night in their room. At 10 in the morning on October 13th, the first Coconino County police officers and National Park Service investigators arrived at the Grand Canyon Village. A missing persons report was taken immediately, given the family's status and the medical condition of the missing man's father. Robert Griffin insisted over the phone that his son could not have simply decided to disappear or turn off his phone as a joke. It went against his very nature. Investigators launched a large-scale search operation. Helicopters were sent into the air and began combing the north and south rims of the canyon. The pilots peered into every ledge and crevice, looking for bright spots of clothing or metal glare. At the same time, detectives seized video surveillance footage from the El Tovar Hotel and surrounding areas. Watching hours of footage provided the first and only clue. On October 12th, at 18 hours 45 minutes, a black Mercedes-Benz E-Class was seen leaving the hotel parking lot at 18:45 minutes. Richard's silhouette was clearly visible at the wheel, and Agnes's profile was in the passenger seat. The car moved slowly toward the exit of the villa and turned east onto Route 64, also known as Desert View Drive. It is a scenic road that stretches along the edge of a cliff for 25 miles to the eastern exit of the park. This recording was the last confirmed sighting of the Griffin couple. Investigators immediately sent patrols to the eastern route. They checked every viewpoint where tourists usually stop for sunset photos. The parking lots at Grandview Point, Moran Point, and Lipan Point were inspected inch by inch. Rangers interviewed tourists, showed photos of the couple and the car. No one had seen the black Mercedes. The situation was becoming more and more mysterious. Route 64 is essentially one road with a limited number of exits. The cameras at the park exit near the Desert View Tower did not record the Griffins' car leaving the reserve. This meant that they still had to be somewhere within the park. But a 2-ton German sedan couldn't just disappear into thin air. Dog handlers were involved in the search. The dogs picked up a trail of things in the room, but it ended in the parking lot, right where the couple got into the car. The version of a road accident seemed the most likely. Perhaps Richard had lost control of the car on a complicated serpentine road, and it plunged into the abyss. The helicopters descended, risking hitting rocks, to inspect the foot of the steep cliffs along the route. However, there was no wreckage, no braking marks on the asphalt, and no damaged fenders. 48 hours had passed. The tension in the Scottsdale mansion became unbearable. Robert was hospitalized with an angina attack. Elena stayed in touch with the detective who led the operation. Her voice trembled with helplessness as she repeated over and over again, "They couldn't have just disappeared." But the facts showed otherwise. The car left the hotel, headed deep into the park, and never returned. Not a single witness, not a single camera, not a single tracker could answer where 2 adults in a large black car had gone in the middle of a popular tourist route. The canyon was silent, keeping its new secret. It was only late in the evening of October 14th that one of the rangers, looking through old topographic maps of the eastern sector, noticed a barely visible old dirt road that branched off the highway and led nowhere, to an area that had been closed to visitors for over a decade. On October 15th, 2014, exactly 367 days after the Griffin family's mysterious disappearance, a group of 5 experienced kayakers were paddling a difficult route along the Colorado River. The expedition, led by veteran whitewater tourist Mark O'Connell, was in a remote sector of the park, near the confluence with the Little Colorado River. This place is known for its turquoise waters and absolute isolation from civilization. There is no cell phone service, and the nearest paved road is tens of miles away through sheer cliffs and hot desert. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with the sun at its zenith, the group decided to make an unplanned halt on a small sand spit to wait out the heat and explore the side canyons. One of the group members, 28-year-old David Thorne, walked half a mile away from camp into a narrow canyon that was not marked on standard tourist maps. According to his later testimony to the rangers, his attention was drawn to a strange pile of rocks at the foot of a cliff. Natural rockfalls are common in the canyon, but this structure looked unnatural. The stones of various sizes were tightly fitted together, forming an artificial wall about 4 feet high, blocking the entrance to a niche or grotto. Thorne called the other members of the group. Together they spent nearly 40 minutes dismantling the heavy barricade. When the last large boulder was pushed back, the smell of dry, musty air wafted out of the darkness, not the smell of dampness or decay. Mark O'Connell was the first to turn on a powerful tactical flashlight and direct the beam deep into the cave. What came out of the darkness made the experienced athletes stagger in horror. It looked like a surreal installation or a cruel joke. In the center of the small grotto, on a spread piece of clean blue tarpaulin, 2 people were sitting. They were a man and a woman. They were sitting in a perfect lotus position, facing each other, so close that their knees were touching. Their backs were unnaturally straight, their hands resting calmly on their hips, palms up. But it wasn't their position that was most frightening. It was their appearance. Richard and Agnes Griffin, who had been presumed dead for a year, were wearing brand new, clean gray tracksuits with no logos or tags. There was no dust, dirt, or signs of wear on their clothes, which would be impossible for people who had spent a year in the wild. The skin on their faces was pale, almost transparent, like parchment with a network of veins showing through. They were emaciated to the extreme. Their cheekbones stuck out sharply, their eyes sunk deep into their sockets, resembling skulls covered in leather. They looked directly into each other's eyes, without blinking, without moving. At first, The tourists thought they had found bodies that someone had deliberately planted like that. David Thorne cautiously approached and touched the man's shoulder. The body was warm. A faint vibration could be felt under his fingers. The heart was beating. "They're alive!" Thorne shouted, but his voice echoed off the cave walls, causing no reaction from the survivors. The kayakers began to act chaotically. Someone took out a water bottle, trying to give the woman a drink. The water flowed down her chin without triggering a swallowing reflex. She did not even flinch when the cold liquid hit her neck. Her pupils were dilated and did not react to the light of the flashlight shining directly into their faces. They continued to look through their rescuers, through the walls of the cave, into some abyss known only to them. Richard and Agnes were breathing shallowly and rarely. Every few minutes their eyelids slowly dropped and rose, as if in slow motion. This was the only sign that their brains were still controlling basic bodily functions. Otherwise, they resembled broken biological mechanisms that had had their power source removed. O'Connell took out his satellite phone and dialed the emergency number. The conversation with the dispatcher was difficult. The operator could not understand the situation. "Have you found the tourists? Are they injured? Are they unconscious?" Mark, looking at the two frozen figures, could barely find his words. "They are conscious, but they are not here. They are like statues. Send a helicopter, immediately." The wait for the evacuation lasted almost 3 hours. The sun began to set, and long shadows crept into the cave. Tourists sat next to the survivors, afraid to break the silence. The atmosphere was depressing. The feeling that these two people were not just lost, but that something terrible had been done to them, was getting stronger and stronger. They could not have been left here. Someone had brought them here, changed their clothes, put them in this position, and bricked up the entrance, leaving them to die of thirst in the dark, looking into the eyes of a loved one. At about 17 hours and 30 minutes, we heard the roar of screws. A National Park Service rescue helicopter hovered over the canyon, kicking up clouds of red dust. The medics descended using winches. Seeing the condition of the victims, even experienced paramedics were momentarily confused. During the initial examination, it turned out that the leg muscles of both of them were so atrophied and frozen in one position that they could not be extended without risking a fracture. Richard and Agnes had to be fixed on a stretcher in the same lotus position in which they were found. As they were being lifted on board, one of the paramedics noticed a detail that gave him chills. On the wrists of both of them, where the pulse can be felt, the skin was perfectly clean, with no sun or scratches, but with subtle traces of regular injections. Dozens of tiny dots formed a kind of path along the veins. Someone had kept them alive to turn them into this. The helicopter gained altitude and headed for Flagstaff, carrying 2 living shells on board. The kayakers stayed down below, near the open cave. Mark O'Connell shone his lantern into the corner of the grotto where the couple was sitting. There, on the sand, under the edge of the tarp, was the only item the kidnappers had left behind, an empty ampule with the labeling almost completely erased, except for 2 letters of the Latin alphabet. Dear friends, before we continue to dive into this confusing and gloomy story, I want to ask you for one important thing. Right now, please click the subscribe button, like this video, and write any comment, at least one word. This will help YouTube's algorithms understand that this story is worthy of attention and promote the video to recommendations. Your activity helps the channel to live and talk about such difficult cases. Thank you, and now let's get back to the investigation. On October 20th, 2014, while doctors in the sterile wards of Flagstaff Medical Center were trying to unravel the nature of the couple's condition, another action was unfolding 100 miles west of the Grand Canyon. In the small town of Seligman, frozen in the heyday of Route 66, detectives received information that could be the key to everything that happened a year ago. The local police received a message from the owner of the Willow Creek Storage Garage Cooperative. This place was located on the outskirts of the city, away from neon signs and tourist shops. It was a maze of long rows of rusty metal boxes, where locals stored old furniture and truckers left their cargo. The owner of the cooperative, an elderly man named Earl, said that the lease on one of the boxes had expired exactly 1 week ago, and according to the rules, he was entitled to open it to dispose of the contents. But when he looked inside through the crack, he saw something that made him immediately dial 911. The investigation team arrived at the site at noon. Box number 217 was unremarkable except for a heavy padlock covered in a layer of dust. The owner of the cooperative told the detectives that exactly 1 year ago, in October 2013, a man who called himself John Doe came to him. He wore a cap pulled down over his eyes and spoke little. The stranger paid the rent in cash for exactly 1 year in advance, without haggling or asking questions. He left no phone number or real address. In the registration log, there was only a dash against the box number. When the lock was cut off with special tools and the metal shutters were lifted with a roar, the smell of stale air, oil, and old rubber hit my nose. In the semi-darkness of the garage, covered with a thick layer of gray dust, stood a black E-Class Mercedes-Benz. It took less than a minute to match the license plate. It was Richard and Agnes Griffin's car, the same one that left the El Tovar Hotel a year ago and disappeared. The car was perfectly intact. No scratches, dents, or signs of the accident that the police initially thought it had been. It just stood there, as if in a time capsule, waiting to be found. Forensic scientists in hazmat suits began to inspect the cabin, recording every detail. What they found inside completely overturned the investigation's understanding of the motives for the crime. On the passenger seat, carelessly thrown, was a blue folder with documents. These were the papers of Richard's architectural firm. The detective, flipping through the pages with latex gloves, immediately realized their importance. It was a complete package of documents on the merger of Griffin's firm with a large developer, a deal that Richard was categorically against and planned to block immediately after returning from vacation. The presence of these papers in the car, hundreds of miles away from the office, indicated that someone was very eager to see these documents disappear with the owner. The motive was instantly transformed from a random attack by a madman into something much more calculated and cynical. But the next discovery made even experienced police officers feel cold. On the back seat, in the middle of the perfectly clean leather upholstery, was a teddy bear, an ordinary children's toy with a brown bow. It looked absurd and creepy. After contacting Agnes's parents, the investigators learned the painful truth. The couple could not have children. Agnes was infertile, and this was her biggest tragedy, a topic that was taboo in the family. They never bought toys and avoided children's departments. This bear did not belong to them. Someone put it there on purpose, as a mockery, as a cruel hint or signature of the author of this crime. It was pure psychological sadism. But the most important evidence was waiting on the dashboard. The GPS navigator was turned off, but its battery still had some charge left. The technical expert connected the device to an external power supply. The screen lit up, loading the trip history. The last point of the route, entered into the device's memory on October 12, 2013, did not lead to the hotel, the observation deck, or the exit from the park. The cursor on the electronic map froze in a desert area near the town of Williams, on territory that was marked as private property. The description of the location in the navigator's database was short and strange. Former ostrich farm. This was the place where the car stopped before entering this garage. The detective looked at the map. The farm was in a secluded place, far from the highways and the eyes of witnesses. He immediately passed the coordinates on to the raid team. On October 22, 2014, an atmosphere of strict secrecy reigned at Flagstaff Medical Center. The fourth floor of the neurology department was completely closed to visitors, and 2 police officers were on duty around the clock near the intensive care unit. Behind the doors of this ward was what would later be called in medical journals one of the most complex and brutal cases in the history of modern neurotoxicology. The clinic's chief neurologist, Dr. Alan Evans, had assembled a consultation of the state's best specialists. They faced a task that seemed impossible: to explain the condition of Richard and Agnes Griffin. The initial examination, conducted immediately after the evacuation, yielded paradoxical results that did not fit any standard clinical picture. The physical condition of the patients caused cognitive dissonance among the doctors. People who had allegedly spent a year in the harsh desert conditions showed no signs of dehydration or critical exhaustion. Their weight was reduced but stable. Their skin was unnaturally pale, almost transparent, indicating a complete lack of sunlight for at least 12 months. Critical vitamin D and calcium deficiencies had left their bones brittle, and their leg and back muscles had suffered profound atrophy. The doctors stated that these people did not walk and hardly moved for a whole year. Their joints had partially lost mobility and were fixed in a sitting position. But the worst thing was not in the muscles or bones, but inside the skull. Magnetic resonance imaging showed that the brain structure of both patients was physically intact. There were no tumors, hemorrhages, or traumatic injuries. However, the functional scan revealed a terrifying picture. The cerebral cortex, which is responsible for personality, memory, speech, and self-awareness, was actually turned off. The electrical activity in these areas was minimal, at the level of deep sleep or coma, although the patient's eyes were open. The clue came from the toxicology laboratory on the third day. An extensive hair analysis, which acts as a kind of time chronicle of substance use, showed the chronology of the murder of the human soul. The results made even the most cynical laboratory technicians shudder. For 365 days, Richard and Agnes were methodically pumped with a powerful chemical cocktail, the composition of which was chosen with devilish precision. The basis of the mixture was high-dose haloperidol, a powerful neuroleptic that suppresses mental activity and will, turning a person into a submissive creature. Synthetic opioids were added to it, causing severe dependence and a feeling of complete indifference to the world around them. But the key ingredient was scopolamine, a substance known in the criminal world as the devil's breath. This drug blocks memory formation and makes a person extremely susceptible to suggestion, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. Dr. Evans used the term chemical lobotomy in a closed-door meeting with investigators. It was not a murder in the literal sense. It was a slow, calculated erasure of identity. Richard and Agnes were kept in a state of artificial pharmacological coma, combined with complete sensory deprivation. They were kept in darkness, silence, and under the constant influence of drugs. Day after day, the neural connections that formed their I disintegrated and faded away. Their brains simply forgot how to be human. Now, lying on white hospital sheets, they were perfect biological mechanisms. They could swallow liquid food on their own if you put a spoon to their mouths. Their bodies were fulfilling their natural needs, but they were doing it reflexively, for themselves, without realizing the process. When Richard's parents, Robert and Elena, were allowed into the ward, a scene took place that made even the nurses on duty cry. Robert, barely able to stand up after a heart attack, went to his son's bedside. He called him by name, took his hand, begged him to look at him. Richard slowly turned his head toward the sound. His eyes, once full of intelligence and life, now resembled glass balls. He looked at his father but did not see him. There was no recognition, no love, not even fear in that look. There was an absolute, ringing emptiness. Richard Griffin, a successful architect and a loving son, had ceased to exist. All that remained was a body that breathed and blinked. Investigators watching through a mirrored glass began to realize the scale of the crime. This was not the work of a lone psychopath acting chaotically. Someone had held two adults hostage for a year, providing them with food, water, hygiene, and, most importantly, expensive and specific medications. Someone washed them, cut their nails, changed their clothes, and injected poison into their veins every day, according to a schedule, calculating the dose so as not to kill the body, but to guarantee the destruction of the mind. This required resources, premises, knowledge, and, most importantly, tremendous composure. The attacker did not want them to die. He wanted them just like that, living but silent dolls. Living statues that could not tell anything, sign anything, or deny anything. On the evening of October 22, the head nurse of the ward, filling out the patient's chart, drew the detective's attention to one detail that had previously escaped his attention. She pointed to the injection marks on Agnes's arms. The punctures were made perfectly, precisely, without hematomas and inflammation, strictly into the veins, changing the injection sites to avoid thrombosis. This could not have been done by an amateur. The man who turned the couple into vegetables had professional medical training. On October 25, 2014, the investigation moved from hospital wards and dusty garages to the sterile world of big money. Detective Michael Harris arrived in the business center of Phoenix, where the headquarters of the prestigious Sterling & Partners law firm was located on the 43rd floor of a glass and concrete skyscraper. It was this company that had been handling the Griffin family's cases for the past decade, and it was here, among the embossed leather folders and expensive suits, that the answer to the question, why, was hidden. Up to this point, the police had bodies turned into dolls and a car with evidence, but no clear motive. Psychopathy, or revenge, seemed too simple an explanation for a crime that required such complex logistics and financial costs. Harris realized that to hold two people captive for a year, to buy specific medications and rent a room, serious money was needed, and even more money was to be the reward for this risk. The firm's senior partner, visibly nervous, gave the investigation access to Richard Griffin's financial history for the past year. The analysis of the documents revealed a figure who had previously remained in the shadow of the tragedy: Stephen Griffin, the 37-year-old cousin of the missing architect. In the Griffin family hierarchy, Stephen has always occupied the place of the poor relative, an unsuccessful realtor who had not closed a single significant deal in his 10-year career. He was constantly borrowing money from his wealthier cousin and had a reputation for living beyond his means. However, the documents showed an amazing metamorphosis. Immediately after Richard and Agnes disappeared in October 2013, Stephen used a little-known clause in the architectural firm's charter to claim temporary management of the assets. The legal casuistry played into his hands. Richard's father, Robert, was recognized by a medical commission as unable to manage the business due to a serious heart condition. His mother, Helen, was in a state of deep shock. Stephen, as the closest capable relative, was given complete carte blanche. What happened next resembled a raider attack disguised as crisis management. Richard's main asset was his architectural firm, which owned the rights to a number of high-end projects. Prior to his disappearance, Richard had strongly opposed the merger with a large development corporation, considering their construction methods barbaric. He planned to veto the deal as soon as he returned from vacation. But he never returned. Exactly 3 months after his brother's disappearance, Stephen Griffin signed the merger agreement. This one stroke of the pen earned him a personal bonus of $3 million and a seat on the board of directors of the combined company. Detective Harris, reviewing Stephen's bank statements, was struck by the cynicism of the spending. While Richard's parents had sold family jewelry and paintings to pay for private investigators, helicopter searches, and dog handlers, Stephen had not spent a single cent on his brother's search. Instead, his reports showed him buying a new sports car, renting a penthouse, and taking expensive vacations in Las Vegas. He acted as if he knew for sure that there was no point in looking for Richard, because he would never be found, at least not for a while. But the real shock came at the end of the meeting. The firm's lawyer hesitantly handed Harris another folder that was not filed with the main case. It was a draft of a legal motion prepared by order of Stephen Griffin. The document was entitled, "On the Establishment of a Permanent Guardianship over Incapacitated Persons." The text of the document was drawn up with terrible foresight. In it, Stephen asked the court to appoint him as the sole guardian of Richard and Agnes Griffin in the event of their death. The petition described in detail the need to manage their property and trust fund because, and I quote, "As a result of prolonged exposure to extreme conditions and possible psychological trauma, they will not be able to make decisions for themselves." The scheme became clear. Stephen didn't need any bodies. In the event of Richard's official death, a huge inheritance would go to his parents, and then, possibly, to charities, as stated in his will. Stephen would be left with nothing. But if Richard and Agnes survive, but are recognized as vegetables, legally incapacitated, control of their money passes to a guardian. Stephen created ideal cash cows for himself, living puppets whose existence guaranteed him access to millions. Detective Harris felt his hands go cold as his gaze fell on the date the file was created. This document was not a reaction to the news of the found spouses. The draft had been logged into the law firm's system on October 8, 2014. This was exactly 1 week before the kayakers accidentally stumbled upon the walled cave. 7 days before the miraculous rescue, Stephen Griffin already knew that his relatives would return, and he knew exactly what condition they would be in. He was preparing to receive them not as survivors, but as property, inventory. Harris looked up at the lawyer. "He's been rushing us with these papers," the lawyer said quietly. "Stephen called every day and demanded that everything be ready by October 15th. He said he had a premonition." The detective grabbed the file. Stephen's premonition had a very specific geographical reference. Among the drafts of the documents, a small piece of paper fell out, a receipt from a roadside cafe, dated the same October 8th. The location on the receipt pointed to a place far from offices and luxury, a place where secrets were ideally kept. On October 27, 2014, An investigative team led by Detective Michael Harris went to the coordinates retrieved from the GPS memory of the recovered Mercedes. The point on the map pointed to a remote stretch of desert, 10 miles north of the town of Williams, Arizona. It was a gray area, where paved roads ended and abandoned ranches and dried grass began. The object that the convoy of police cars approached was a prosperous ostrich farm in the 90s. After the owner's bankruptcy, the territory fell into disrepair. The fences were leaning, the bird pens were overgrown with bushes, and the main house had become a ruin with broken windows that let the wind blow through. The place looked like the perfect setting for a horror movie, but the worst was not in the ruined house, but underground. Special forces surrounded the perimeter, checking every shed and shed. There were no signs of life. However, Harris's attention was drawn to one building located far from the main complex. It was an old concrete bunker that had once been used to store grain and feed to protect it from rodents and heat. Unlike the other structures, which were falling apart over time, the massive steel doors of this bunker looked surprisingly sturdy. It had a new, expensive padlock, which contrasted sharply with the rust on the hinges. When the Special Forces soldiers used hydraulic scissors to cut the lock and open the door with a heavy screech, the investigators were greeted not by darkness and the stench of rotten grain, but by a wave of cold, sterile air saturated with the smell of chlorine and medical alcohol. What they saw inside made even veteran police officers stop at the threshold. This was not a prison in the classical sense. It was a high-tech intensive care unit set up in the middle of the desert. The walls, ceiling, and even the doors were tightly padded with a thick layer of black acoustic foam. This material absorbed any sound, creating absolute, dead silence inside. A person who shouted at the top of his lungs here would not be heard even a meter away from the outer wall. In the center of the room, under the bright light of diode lamps powered by powerful car batteries, were 2 hospital beds. They were covered with perfectly white linen. Soft but sturdy leather hand and leg restraints were attached to the metal rails. Next to each bed were medical drip racks with half-empty saline bags still hanging on them. The tubes from the drips hung down neatly, resembling tentacles. The metal table in the corner was in perfect order. There were packs of disposable syringes, sterile napkins, boxes of adult diapers, and several vials without labels. This place was not designed to kill a body, but to keep life in a vegetable state. There were no windows, no clocks, nothing to remind the prisoners of the passage of time or the change of day and night. Only white light, silence, and a needle in the vein. The main piece of evidence found during the search was a thick, hardbound notebook in a desk drawer. It was the observation journal. The handwriting was small, neat, and professional, the kind of handwriting doctors use when filling out medical records. There were no names in the journal, only Subject 1, Richard, and Subject 2, Agnes. Detective Harris, wearing gloves, began to turn the pages. It was a chronicle of dehumanization. Records were kept daily for 365 days. Day 14, Subject 1 is trying to resist. A double dose of haloperidol was administered. The condition is stabilized. Speech activity is suppressed. Day 45, Subject 2 refuses to eat. A nasogastric tube was inserted. Scopolamine was administered to suppress the will. Pupil reaction is sluggish. The memory of the previous day is erased. Day 230. Subject 2 was crying in her sleep. She said the word, Mom. A corrective dose of sedatives was administered. Emotional background leveled to 0. Each entry was a dry, cynical report on how the soul was being etched out of people. They recorded sleep time, amount of fluids administered, frequency of bowel movements, and drug dosage. The author of these records felt no pity. For him or her, it was just a medical experiment or a contract job. Inspecting the wastebasket, which the jailer had apparently forgotten to empty cleaned out before his escape, the forensic experts found a crumpled paper bag with the logo of a pharmacy chain. Inside were several receipts. The dates on the receipts were fresh. The last one had been written only 2 weeks ago. The place of purchase was a pharmacy in Kingman, an hour's drive west of the farm. The shopping list included saline, glucose, large-capacity syringes, and alcohol wipes. The forensic scientist carefully opened one of the receipts with tweezers and treated it with a special powder on the spot, hoping to get at least some clues. Under the light of an ultraviolet lamp, clear fingerprints appeared on the thermal paper. Harris expected to see the large prints of Stephen Griffin, whose financial fraud had already been exposed. But the expert, looking through the magnifying glass, shook his head. "It's not Stephen, detective," he said quietly. "The prints are too small. Narrow phalanges, thin lines." He held the receipt up to the light. It was a woman's hand. A woman bought this medicine. A woman kept this journal. And, judging by the neatness with which everything is laid out here, it was a woman who spent a whole year at these people's bedsides, holding their hands while she injected the poison. On October 29, 2014, the Griffin investigation reached the home stretch. The Arizona State Crime Laboratory, working in emergency mode, identified the owner of the fingerprints found on the pharmacy receipts in the bunker in less than a day. A database of medical professionals produced a complete dossier. Martha Vance, a 36-year-old former nurse. Her professional biography read like a story of a downfall. 5 years ago, Vance was scandalously fired from a private psychiatric clinic in Tucson. The official reason for her dismissal was her mistreatment of patients and suspicion of stealing powerful drugs, including neuroleptics. However, the criminal case was dropped due to lack of direct evidence, and Marta simply disappeared from the medical radar, taking care of herself with occasional jobs. But the most interesting connection was found not in medical records, but in Scottsdale school archives. Martha Vance and Stephen Griffin attended the same high school. Moreover, they dated in their senior year 19 years ago. This was the link that closed the chain. The perpetrator with medical knowledge and the customer with motive and money knew each other for half their lives. Investigators quickly located the suspect. Her credit cards, which had been dormant for a year, suddenly became active. On October 28, she paid for a room at a cheap motel called Desert Sands on the outskirts of Kingman, located at the intersection of historic Route 66 and Interstate 40. This town was an ideal staging area for those planning to disappear forever in California or Mexico. The takedown team, led by Detective Harris, arrived at the motel at 6 in the evening. The operation was lightning fast. When the SWAT team kicked in the door of room 104, Martha Vance was just zipping up a large travel bag. She did not put up any resistance. Her face, tired and haggard, showed not so much surprise as fatal doom. On the nightstand was a bus ticket to Los Angeles and a wad of cash, $10,000 in bankrolls tied with rubber bands. The interrogation of Martha Vance, which began an hour later at the local police station, was perhaps the most frightening episode of the whole case. The woman did not demand a lawyer or play silent. Realizing that Stephen was not going to save her, she decided to speak, hoping for a lighter sentence. Her testimony revealed the mechanics of the crime, which was striking in its cold, inhuman logic. According to Martha, Stephen Griffin found her a year ago. He knew about her financial problems and her layoff. He offered her a job to take care of 2 difficult relatives in a private facility. The fee was $50,000 a year plus expenses. She admitted that Stephen personally brought Richard and Agnes to the bunker at the ostrich farm on the night of October 13th, 2013. The couple was unconscious. Stephen had injected them with the first dose of tranquilizers at the hotel, mixing the drug into wine. Martha claimed that her task was only to keep them alive, and most importantly, to keep them in a state of deep sedation. "He didn't want them to die," Martha said calmly, looking at her handcuffed hands. "He explained the math to me. If Richard dies, his money goes to his parents. Stephen gets 0. But if Richard is alive but has lost his mind, if he's a vegetable who needs to be cared for, then Stephen becomes the guardian, and he gets control over everything. He needed living puppets. The plan was designed for 1 year. This was enough time for Stephen to legally secure the status of missing persons, obtain temporary powers, and pull off the merger deal. When the money was in his accounts, it was time for the second stage, the return. Marta described in detail the logistics of the final act of this drama. 2 days before the kayakers found the cave, Stephen rented a motorboat. Under the cover of night, they took Richard and Agnes, who were under the influence of a horse's dose of scopolamine, down the Colorado River. The place was chosen in advance, a hard-to-reach grotto that Stephen had found on old maps. "We changed them into new costumes in the boat," Martha said monotonously. "Stephen wanted it to look like a ritual, like a cult, or crazy. He put them in that pose himself. He said, 'When they find them, No one will believe that one person did this. Everyone will think they went crazy in the desert. It was Stephen who insisted on sitting them facing each other. It was not a romantic gesture, but a cold calculation. This pose was to convince doctors and police that the couple had lost their minds voluntarily, as a result of some kind of mystical psychosis. This would guarantee the diagnosis of incapacity and open a direct path to guardianship for Stephen. He expected that there were many tourists on the river, and the strange find would be discovered within 3 to 4 days. There was a risk of death from dehydration, but Stephen did not care. The main thing was to find the bodies before they were completely dry. At the end of the interview, Detective Harris asked about the teddy bear found in the car. For the first time during the conversation, Martha smiled wryly. It was Stephen's idea. He laughed when he put it in there. He said, "Now they'll finally have the child they've been dreaming of. Only this child will never grow up, just like they did." Martha Vance's testimony was exhaustive. She signed the confession at 22 hours and 30 minutes. But as Harris was leaving the interrogation room, his phone vibrated. It was the district attorney's office calling. Information about Martha's detention had somehow leaked to the press, and the news had already appeared in the news feeds. Stephen Griffin, who had presumably been monitoring the situation every second, now knew that his accomplice had spoken. The police had critically little time left before the main architect of this nightmare tried to disappear. Harris ordered the capture team to move immediately to Phoenix, but he did not know that Stephen had prepared a last, desperate move. On October 30th, 2014, a few hours after Martha Vance signed the confession, Operation Canyon reached its climax in the financial center of Phoenix. Stephen Griffin was in his new corner office on the 35th floor. His secretary would later tell investigators that he was in high spirits that morning, booking tickets for a private flight to the Cayman Islands and looking through luxury real estate catalogs. He felt like a winner, a man who had beaten fate and gotten away with it. When the door to his office opened and 4 detectives, accompanied by SWAT officers, entered, Stephen did not even get out of his chair. According to eyewitnesses, he calmly finished his coffee and asked if they had a warrant. His arrest took place under the guns of dozens of cameras from news channels that had already surrounded the skyscraper. Even as the handcuffs clicked on his wrists, Stephen smiled into the lenses, continuing to play the role of a successful businessman who had become the victim of a misunderstanding. The trial began on December 10, 2014, and became one of the most high-profile events in the history of the state of Arizona. Stephen's line of defense was based on cynical lies. His lawyers tried to convince the jury that their client's actions were an extreme measure of crisis management. Stephen claimed that he was saving the family business from collapse, and that Richard and Agnes's isolation was necessary for their own rehabilitation from drug addiction, which he allegedly invented to defame the victims. However, the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor showed the courtroom a logbook of observations from the bunker, where Marta's handwriting recorded the methodical destruction of individuals. Bank statements were presented, confirming transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore accounts on the days when the objects received critical doses of neuroleptics. Recordings of phone conversations where Stephen called his brother a vegetable and joked about puppet theater caused a wave of indignation in the courtroom, which the judge had to calm down with a gavel. The sentence was harsh and final. Martha Vance, taking into account her cooperation with the investigation, was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. Stephen Griffin was found guilty on all charges: kidnapping, grievous bodily harm, fraud, and financial fraud. The judge, reading out the verdict, called his actions an act of absolute, distilled cruelty, devoid of any sign of humanity. Stephen was sentenced to 3 life terms without the possibility of parole. He was led out of the courtroom to the curses of the crowd, but his face remained stone-faced. The end of this tragedy takes us to a completely different place, far from prison cells and courtrooms. The Green Valley Private Clinic is located in a picturesque suburb, surrounded by high fences and dense gardens. The place is silent, broken only by birdsong. This place has become a new home for Richard and Agnes. Their room looks more like the living room of an expensive hotel. Panoramic windows overlook a well-kept garden with blooming magnolias. In the center of the room are 2 comfortable, upholstered chairs. Richard and Agnes are sitting in them. The clinic staff, fulfilling their parents' request, sits them every day as they used to sit in that cursed cave, facing each other. Physically, they have recovered. Their skin has acquired a healthy hue, they have gained weight, their clothes are impeccable. But behind this external facade lies a void. The best neurologists in the world have thrown up their hands. The cerebral cortex has undergone irreversible changes. Chemical lobotomy has achieved its goal. They live in an eternal now, devoid of memory, desires, and understanding. Every day, at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Robert and Elena Griffin come to the ward. Old Robert, who now moves only in a wheelchair, takes a book and starts reading aloud. Usually it is Richard's favorite novels, Fitzgerald or Hemingway. Elena sits next to him, holding her son's hand, and cries quietly, wiping her tears with a lace handkerchief. They tell the children news they don't understand, and show them pictures of people they don't recognize. The last episode of our story takes place during the evening rounds. The sun is setting, flooding the room with a warm orange light, reminiscent of the colors of the Grand Canyon. The nurse, a young girl named Sarah, comes in to prepare the patients for bed. She gently adjusts the blanket on Agnes's lap, who sits motionless, staring at the space in front of her. Suddenly, something happens that makes the nurse freeze. Agnes turns her head slowly, very slowly. Her gaze, usually unfocused and blank, finds Richard's face. For one brief, almost imperceptible moment, a spark flashes in her eyes. It's not just a reflex. The muscles of her face tense slightly. The corners of her lips quiver as if trying to form a smile or a grimace of pain. Something alive awakens for a second in the depths of her dilated pupils. A shadow of a memory, an echo of love, or a mute cry for help. She looks at the man she loved and whom she no longer knows. But the very next second, the light in her eyes goes out. The face relaxes again, turning into a smooth, indifferent mask. The head drops. Richard, sitting across from her, doesn't even notice this movement. He continues to look through her, into his own abyss. They stayed together, as they had promised once at the altar, but their souls are locked in different rooms of a huge, empty house, the keys to which are lost forever. And in this silence, it seems that somewhere deep inside, behind the thick walls of silence, they are still screaming.